March 15, 2023. Riyadh, Saudi Arabia. The city is quiet at this hour. The desert air hangs still, warm even before sunrise. Inside a government complex guarded by floodlights and silence, a brief statement is prepared. Dry, technical, almost forgettable. No press conference. No emergency address. No dramatic announcement. Just a few carefully chosen words. Saudi Arabia will begin accepting Chinese yuan for oil sales. Not exclusively. Not immediately. But unmistakably. For nearly half a century, oil, the lifeblood of modern civilization, had flowed through a single financial artery, the U.S. dollar. That system had survived wars, crises, recessions, and revolutions. It had outlasted presidents, kings, and empires. And now, quietly, it had been breached. Most of the world slept through it. Most Americans would never hear about it. But historians may one day mark this moment as the beginning of the end of an era. Because this wasn't just a currency choice. It wasn't just trade diversification. It was a crack in the foundation of a system that allowed one nation to live far beyond its means for 50 years. This is the paradox at the heart of modern America. How did a country with chronic trade deficits, exploding debt, and constant war spending continue to live better than nations that produced more, saved more, and borrowed less? The answer lies in a system so powerful, so normalized, that most people never even learned its name. The petrodollar. To understand why its collapse matters, we must return to a moment when the United States itself stood on the brink, not of decline, but of desperation. August 15, 1971. 8 p.m. Washington, D.C. President Richard Nixon sits behind a desk in the Oval Office, staring into a television camera. His face is tense. His words are rehearsed. The United States will suspend the convertibility of the dollar into gold. With that sentence, the Bretton Woods system, designed at the end of World War II, collapsed. For the first time in modern history, the world's reserve currency was backed by nothing but trust. No gold, no silver, just confidence. Foreign governments panicked. Economists warned of collapse. Allies feared chaos. If the dollar was no longer backed by gold, why should anyone hold it? The answer came not from economists, but from geopolitics. In the shadows of the Cold War, American diplomats and strategists engineered a new foundation for dollar dominance. Not based on precious metal, but on something far more essential: oil. In 1974, the United States struck a deal with Saudi Arabia, the world's most powerful oil producer. Saudi oil would be sold only in U.S. dollars. In return, the U.S. would provide military protection, weapons, and political support. The deal spread across OPEC. Oil-exporting nations recycled their dollar earnings into U.S. banks and treasury bonds. And just like that, a new system was born. The petrodollar system. Every country on Earth needed oil. To buy oil, they needed dollars. To get dollars, they needed to trade with or borrow from the United States. America could now print its own demand. This was not just monetary dominance. It was structural power. For 50 years, the system worked brilliantly. The U.S. ran trade deficits without consequence. It funded wars without raising taxes. It consumed more than it produced year after year. Other nations sent goods. America sent paper. This was the free lunch. And it came with a bill deferred to the future. But no system built on trust alone lasts forever. And the very tools that once protected the dollar would eventually begin to destroy it. In the decades that followed, the U.S. weaponized its financial dominance. Sanctions replaced invasions. Banking access became leverage. Payment systems turned into pressure points. The dollar wasn't just money, it was a tool of enforcement. And slowly, quietly, the rest of the world began to ask a dangerous question. What happens if the dollar is turned against us? That question would find its answer in 2022. And from that moment on, the countdown would begin. This documentary is not about conspiracy. It is not about collapse tomorrow. It is about patterns, historical, structural, and repeatable. Because the fall of reserve currencies has happened before. And every time, The warning signs looked eerily familiar. The petrodollar didn't die in a single day. It began dying the moment the world decided it needed an alternative. And now, for the first time in 50 years, that alternative is no longer theoretical. It is real. It is growing. And it is accelerating. The problem America was never meant to solve. Every global monetary system begins with a problem. In the early 1970s, the United States faced one of the most dangerous economic dilemmas in modern history. After World War II, the dollar had become the world's reserve currency under the Bretton Woods system, backed by gold at a fixed price of $35 per ounce. Other currencies were tied to the dollar. The system worked until it didn't. By the late 1960s, America was fighting a costly war in Vietnam while expanding social programs at home. Dollars flooded the global system. Foreign governments, particularly France, began demanding gold in exchange for their dollar reserves. The United States did not have enough gold. On August 15, 1971, President Richard Nixon made a decision that shocked the world. He severed the dollar's link to gold. The dollar became fiat, backed by nothing but confidence. Economists warned that without gold, the dollar would collapse. Inflation surged. Trust wavered. The United States needed a new anchor for its currency, fast. That anchor would not be metal. It would be oil. Birth of the petrodollar system in 1974, American officials quietly negotiated a deal with Saudi Arabia, the most powerful oil producer on earth. The agreement was simple but revolutionary. Saudi Arabia would sell oil exclusively in U.S. dollars. Excess oil revenues would be reinvested into U.S. Treasury bonds in return. The U.S. would provide military protection, weapons, and political support. Soon, the arrangement expanded across OPEC. Oil, the most essential commodity in the modern world, was now priced in dollars alone. This created a self-reinforcing cycle. Every country needed oil. To buy oil, they needed dollars. To get dollars, they had to trade with the U.S. or borrow from it. The dollar was no longer just currency. It was infrastructure. This system solved America's post-gold problem, but it did far more than that. It transformed the U.S. into the financial center of the world. The free lunch, ERA, begins with global demand for dollars guaranteed. The United States gained a privilege no empire had ever fully possessed before. It could import real goods, oil, electronics, machinery, labor, while exporting paper. Trade deficits no longer mattered. Debt accumulation no longer triggered collapse. Budget discipline became optional. Foreign nations recycled their dollar earnings back into U.S. financial markets, buying treasury bonds to keep the system running. America could now finance military bases across the globe, expensive wars without immediate taxation, consumer lifestyles beyond productive output. This privilege became known as the exorbitant privilege. It worked because trust was high and alternatives were non-existent. For decades, no country could challenge it. Overextension and dependence, but systems built on privilege create incentives for abuse. As the decades passed, America's trade deficits became structural. Manufacturing moved offshore. Consumption replaced production. Debt expanded year after year. By the 2000s, the U.S. was no longer the world's factory. It was the world's consumer. Yet the dollar remained dominant. Why? Because oil was still priced in dollars. Because global trade still cleared through U.S. banks. Because payment systems like SWIFT ran through Western control. The system appeared stable, but beneath the surface, dependency was growing. And dependency is fragile. Financial weaponization. After the Cold War, America discovered something new. It no longer needed tanks to enforce power. It could use finance. Sanctions became the tool of choice. Countries that challenged U.S. policy were cut off from dollar access, banking systems, and international trade. At first, this reinforced the dollar's dominance. But slowly, it planted fear. If dollars could be denied, frozen, or seized, then holding them carried political risk. The dollar was no longer neutral, and neutrality is essential for reserve currencies. The 2008 warning, shot the 2008 global financial crisis marked a turning point. The crisis originated in the United States, but its consequences were exported worldwide. Central banks were forced to hold dollars while absorbing American instability. The U.S. responded by printing trillions. Quantitative easing saved the system, but it also revealed something dangerous. The U.S. could create unlimited dollars without immediate consequence. Other nations took note. Trust remained, but caution entered the system. The 2022 shock in 2022, the United States and its allies froze approximately $300 billion of Russia's foreign reserves. This was unprecedented. Central bank reserves, once considered untouchable, were suddenly political weapons. Every nation watching understood the implication. If reserves can be frozen, they are not truly sovereign. From that moment, de-dollarization accelerated. Not out of ideology, but out of risk management. The rise of alternatives countries began building escape routes. China expanded its CIPS payment system. Bilateral trade agreements bypassed the dollar. Local currencies were used for energy trade. Gold purchases surged to historic highs. BRICS expanded. Energy exporters diversified settlement currencies. Central banks reduced treasury exposure. These moves were quiet, but cumulative. This is how reserve currencies lose dominance. Not through rebellion, but redundancy. Saudi Arabia's decision: when Saudi Arabia accepted Yuan for oil in 2023, it was not an act of defiance. It was an act of realism. China was now its largest trading partner. Demand patterns had shifted. Multipolar trade required multipolar settlement. The petrodollar's exclusivity was broken. Once exclusivity is gone, dominance erodes. Stage 6. Network effects reverse. Every reserve currency collapse reaches a moment when alternatives become usable. Not dominant. Not perfect. Just viable. This is stage 6. At this stage, multiple currencies coexist, payment systems fragment, trust disperses. The dollar remains important, but no longer indispensable. History shows that once this stage is reached, reversal is nearly impossible. Consequences for the United States without reserve dominance. America must adjust. Foreign demand for treasuries declines. Interest rates rise, or money printing accelerates. Imports become expensive. Living standards adjust downward. This is not punishment. It is arithmetic. The free lunch was never free. It was deferred. A historical pattern, not a prophecy. The dollar is not collapsing tomorrow, but the system that insulated it from consequences is weakening. Every previous reserve currency followed this arc, and none escaped it. What comes next, the future, is unlikely to be a single replacement currency. More likely, a multipolar monetary system, regional trade blocs, commodity-backed settlements, reduced American privilege. Less efficiency, more resilience. The core truth: reserve currencies do not fall because they fail. They fall because the world no longer needs to rely on them. The petrodollar solved the 1970s problem, but history does not preserve solutions forever. It replaces them. Every monetary system believes it is permanent until the moment it isn't. The petrodollar did not collapse in a single headline or a sudden crash. There was no global announcement, no closing bell, no emergency summit that declared its end. Instead, it began the way all dominant systems end: quietly, gradually, and then all at once. For half a century, the petrodollar was the invisible engine of American power. It allowed the United States to consume more than it produced, borrow without restraint, and fund wars without asking its citizens to pay the full cost. It transformed paper currency into global demand. It turned deficits into privilege. And because it worked for so long, it was assumed to be unbreakable. But history has never rewarded assumptions. The same forces that once made the petrodollar dominant slowly undermined it. Overreach replaced restraint. Financial power replaced diplomacy. Trust was traded for leverage. The dollar stopped being neutral. And neutrality is the foundation of every global reserve currency. When nations realized their reserves could be frozen, seized, or erased with a keystroke, the logic of the system changed forever. The question was no longer who controls the strongest currency, but who controls access to it. And once that question is asked, diversification becomes inevitable. Gold is accumulated not because it is efficient, but because it cannot be sanctioned. Alternative payment systems emerge not because they are superior, but because they are safer. Local currency trade expands not because it is ideal, but because dependence is risk. This is how reserve systems end. Not with rebellion, with insurance. The shift away from the petrodollar is not ideological. It is structural. Nations are not rejecting the dollar out of hostility. They are reducing exposure to a system that has become unpredictable. And that distinction matters. Because systems do not collapse when enemies attack them. They collapse when participants quietly prepare for life without them. This is the stage the world is entering now. The United States remains a powerful nation. Its economy is vast. Its military unmatched. Its influence deep. But reserve status was never about strength alone. It was about trust, stability, and restraint. When those pillars weaken, privilege fades. The consequences will not arrive overnight. They will unfold slowly, unevenly, and unevenly felt. Import prices will rise before headlines change. Interest rates will pressure households before governments acknowledge reality. Living standards will adjust quietly before narratives catch up. This is not a prophecy. It is a pattern. Every previous reserve currency followed the same arc. Every empire believed it could defy it. None did. The Portuguese real financed global exploration, until it couldn't. The Dutch guilder dominated trade, until alternatives emerged. The British pound ruled finance, until war, debt, and overextension broke its grip. Each transition felt unthinkable, until it happened. The dollar's path is not identical, but the logic is the same. Reserve currencies do not die because they are replaced. They die because the world no longer needs to rely on them. And reliance is the true source of power. What replaces the petrodollar may not be a single currency. It may be a fragmented system, regional blocks, commodity-linked trade, gold-backed settlements, bilateral agreements. Less elegant, less centralized, more resilient. A world with fewer privileges, but more balance. For Americans, this transition will be deeply personal. The cost of imports, the value of savings, the burden of debt, all are connected to reserve status in ways most people never see. When the system changes, those connections become visible. And visibility is often mistaken for crisis. But what we are witnessing is not collapse. It is normalization. A return to economic gravity. The end of a system that allowed one nation to live beyond its means without consequence. Not because it was evil or malicious, but because it was powerful at the right moment in history. Moments pass. Systems evolve. The petrodollar was a solution to a problem in the 1970s. It reshaped the world. It stabilized energy markets. It anchored globalization. But no solution lasts forever. And the greatest mistake of every dominant system is believing that what once worked will always work. The world is not abandoning the dollar. It is hedging against dependency. And once that process begins, it does not reverse. The free lunch is ending, not with chaos, but with accounting. Not with collapse, but with consequence. Not with anger, but with adjustment. History does not punish nations. It balances them. The question is not whether the petrodollar era is ending. The evidence suggests it already is. The only question left is how prepared the world, and America, will be for what comes next. Because when a system that shaped half a century fades, it doesn't just change markets. It changes the rules of the world.